It was a quiet Tuesday morning, and the sun had just started to rise. The air was crisp, and the streets were beginning to fill with the usual hustle and bustle. Emily, a 12-year-old girl, sat in the back of the school bus, staring out of the window. She usually loved the early mornings, watching the sky change from pink to a bright blue, but today felt different. There was a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach, something she couldn't quite explain. The bus was filled with the usual noise of kids chatting, laughing, and joking with each other. It was the same every day. But today Emily wasn't really paying attention to any of it. Her best friend, Jenna, sat next to her, but even she could sense something was off. Emily wasn't the type to keep things to herself, yet today she seemed lost in thought. Her fingers were tapping nervously against her backpack, and her eyes kept darting around as if she was waiting for something to happen. "Are you okay?" Jenna asked, noticing Emily's strange behavior. Emily didn't answer right away. She just stared ahead, her face pale, her eyes wide. Jenna was used to Emily being quiet sometimes, but this was different. There was something in her expression that made Jenna feel uneasy. She decided not to push it, though, thinking maybe Emily just needed some space. The bus turned a corner, and Emily's attention snapped back to the window. The familiar view of the neighborhood passed by, but today it felt unfamiliar. It was like she was seeing it for the first time, yet it felt wrong, like something was out of place. Emily tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to her, growing stronger with every passing second. The other kids were still laughing and joking, completely unaware of the quiet tension hanging in the air. To them, it was just another school day. To Emily, it was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the bus neared the school, Emily's heart began to race. The school was just around the corner, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She couldn't explain it, but something told her that today was going to be different. It wasn't a feeling she had experienced before, and it made her feel uneasy. The bus slowed down as it approached the familiar driveway. Emily knew this place like the back of her hand, but today it felt like a completely different world. As the bus came to a stop, the noise inside seemed to fade into the background. The chatter, the laughter, everything seemed distant, as if Emily was in a bubble, separated from everything happening around her. She looked over at Jenna, who was busy gathering her things. Emily stood up slowly, her body tense, as if she was walking into unknown territory. She paused for a moment before stepping off the bus, glancing back at Mr. Jenkins, the bus driver. He was a kind, older man who had driven the same route for years. He was always calm, always friendly, but today, Emily could see something in his eyes that made her pause. Without thinking, she leaned toward him and whispered 3 words, words that she couldn't fully understand herself, but that felt important. The moment she said them, she felt a chill run down her spine, as if she had just spoken something that would change everything. As Emily stepped off the bus, she tried to shake off the strange feeling that had been growing in her chest all morning. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the entrance of the school, and she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder one more time. The bus had already started moving again, and Mr. Jenkins was turning the wheel, guiding the bus along its usual route. But as the bus pulled away, Emily felt like something important had just happened, something she couldn't quite put into words. Without thinking, her eyes met Mr. Jenkins's through the rearview mirror. His face, usually calm and collected, looked different today. For a brief moment, she saw something flash in his eyes. Uncertainty, concern, maybe even fear. It only lasted a second, but it made Emily stop in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat, and her thoughts quickly raced back to the words she had whispered to him just moments ago. "They're coming today." The words still echoed in her mind, and the more she thought about it, the more they seemed to make sense. But what did they mean? Who was coming? And why did she feel so sure that today was the day? Emily tried to shake off her thoughts as she walked toward the school doors. She had been feeling uneasy all morning, and now it seemed like the world around her was in a kind of slow motion, as if time was dragging on. She tried to focus on the school bell ringing in the distance, the sound that usually made her feel excited to start a new day. But today, it only added to the strange tension in the air. Meanwhile, Mr. Jenkins's mind was working at a different speed. As the bus pulled away from the school and began its next stop, he found himself replaying the moment Emily had whispered those words to him over and over. "They're coming today." He wasn't sure what it meant, but something about the way she had said it made him feel uneasy. There was a certain weight in her voice, something that felt out of place for a typical morning. He wasn't the type of person to overreact or let his emotions get the best of him, but there was something in Emily's eyes, a quiet urgency, that stuck with him. He had seen enough in his years as a bus driver to know that when a kid acted like that, it was usually because something was off. Something big. The more Mr. Jenkins thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't ignore it. He had to do something. He didn't know if it was just his imagination running wild, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was trying to tell him something important, something dangerous. He needed to act quickly, but he didn't know who to turn to. He glanced at the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His mind raced as he thought about what to do next. Should he call someone? Should he report it to the school? He wasn't sure, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He needed to contact someone in authority, someone who could investigate the situation. By the time he reached the next stop, Mr. Jenkins had made up his mind. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for his supervisor, hoping they could help him make sense of what had just happened. As the phone rang in his ear, he couldn't help but wonder if Emily had known something he didn't. And if so, what could be waiting for them all on this strange, unsettling day. As Emily walked into the school, she tried to act normal, like everything was fine. She joined the line of students making their way toward the entrance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her thoughts kept going back to the 3 words she had whispered to Mr. Jenkins. "They're coming today." They repeated in her mind, as if they were stuck in a loop she couldn't escape. She wanted to forget about it, but every time she tried to push the thought away, it came back stronger. She had no idea what those words meant, but deep down, she knew they were important. It was almost as if something inside her was warning her, telling her that today wasn't just an ordinary school day. But how could she explain that to anyone? How could she make someone understand that she felt something was about to happen, something big and unknown? Her footsteps slowed as she reached the school doors. The hallway was bustling with students, all talking and laughing, completely unaware of the feeling Emily had inside her. The bell rang, and everyone hurried to their classrooms, but Emily couldn't bring herself to follow the crowd. Instead, she lingered at the door, staring out into the distance. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the overwhelming feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. Inside the bus, Mr. Jenkins was doing his best to focus on the road, but he couldn't stop thinking about Emily. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, trying to figure out what had really happened. "They're coming today." What did she mean by that? Who was coming? Why had she said it to him? As he drove along, his concern grew. He couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. His instincts were telling him to do something, anything, to make sure everyone at the school was safe. But what if he was just overreacting? What if it was all in his head? But no, Emily's expression, her tone, it all felt too serious to ignore. His mind was racing as he drove, and by the time he reached the next stop, he had made a decision. He couldn't just sit by and wait for something to happen. He had to take action, even if it meant being wrong. But what if Emily was right? What if something was going to happen today, and he was the only one who could stop it? Mr. Jenkins pulled over to the side of the road and dialed his supervisor's number. His hand shook slightly as he waited for the call to connect. He needed to get someone's attention, someone who could investigate what he had heard. He briefly explained the situation to his supervisor, who seemed just as concerned as he was. But it wasn't enough just to talk about it. They needed to do something now. "Call the school," the supervisor said urgently. "Let them know what's going on." And call the authorities, too. With that, Mr. Jenkins didn't waste any time. He quickly called the school, leaving a message for the principal, and then made the call to the local authorities. His heart pounded in his chest as he spoke, but he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. Emily's words were stuck in his head, and he had a feeling that this wasn't just some coincidence. As he drove on, he couldn't help but feel that he had done the right thing. Maybe, just maybe, the school would be prepared for whatever was coming. But what was coming? That was the question that haunted his thoughts as he continued on his route. Mr. Jenkins felt a heavy weight in his chest as the phone call to the authorities ended. He had done everything he could, but now he felt unsure about what would happen next. His thoughts were racing, and he couldn't help but feel that time was running out. Emily had whispered something important, and he had acted on it. But was it enough? What if he was overreacting? What if nothing happened, and it was all just a misunderstanding? As he drove, his mind wouldn't stop racing. He kept thinking back to Emily's face, to the fear and urgency in her eyes. She had said, "They're coming today," and that phrase had stuck with him like a broken record. He knew that he had to trust his gut, and it had led him to make the calls. He hoped he hadn't made a mistake. Back at the school, everything seemed like it was running smoothly. Students were entering the building, teachers were greeting their classes, and the day seemed normal, at least on the surface. But underneath, there was a quiet hum of activity that no one could see yet. The phone call from Mr. Jenkins had triggered something, and now the school was being watched closely. The FBI had been alerted, and agents were on their way. Principal Hayes had just finished a meeting when he received the call. The calm, normal morning had suddenly taken a turn. The voice on the other end of the line was clear and firm. "We need to lock down the school immediately." The words didn't make sense at first, but as the details were explained, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The authorities had been tipped off about a possible threat, and the situation was serious. Within minutes, the principal issued a school-wide lockdown. The loudspeakers in every classroom crackled to life, and the message echoed through the hallways. All students and staff must go into lockdown. Do not open doors. Do not leave your classrooms. Remain calm and wait for further instructions. Teachers quickly closed their classroom doors, locking them and turning off the lights. Students, confused and frightened, looked at each other, unsure of what was happening. Some began to whisper, speculating about what could be the reason for the lockdown, but no one knew. Everyone's nerves were on edge, and the school that had just moments ago been filled with energy and laughter now felt eerily quiet. In the hallway, students stood pressed against walls, trying to listen for any signs of what was going on. No one knew how long the lockdown would last, but there was a sense of unease that hung in the air like a cloud. What was happening? Why was the school being locked down? And most importantly, why had it all started so suddenly? While the students waited, the agents arrived. Unmarked cars pulled into the parking lot, their tires crunching on the gravel as they parked quickly. The FBI agents moved swiftly, gathering at the front entrance of the school, preparing for whatever lay ahead. It was clear to everyone now. This was serious, and something big was unfolding in real time. Emily, still trying to make sense of the strange feeling that had settled in her gut, was now sitting in her classroom, staring at the door. Her mind kept racing, but now she felt a little less afraid. Maybe she had done the right thing by speaking up. She couldn't know for sure, but at least she wasn't alone in this. There were people out there who had listened and were doing something about it. Outside, the world continued on, but inside the school, everything had changed in an instant. Inside the school, the silence was deafening. Students sat in their classrooms, trying to make sense of what was happening. The lockdown had come so suddenly, and no one knew why. Whispers spread like wildfire as kids exchanged nervous glances, wondering if anyone knew more than they did. Some were texting their parents. Others were just sitting quietly, staring at the door, waiting for someone to tell them it was over. Emily sat at her desk, her heart still racing. She felt a strange mix of fear and relief. She had been so worried when she first whispered those words to Mr. Jenkins, but now, as she sat in her classroom, she couldn't help but feel like maybe she had done the right thing. She hadn't fully understood why she had said what she did, but she was starting to see that it had mattered. Maybe it had saved them all. Her mind kept wandering back to the words she had spoken. They're coming today. She still didn't know who they were, but the feeling in her chest told her it was something big, something important. She wanted to ask the teacher what was going on, but the look on Mrs. Parker's face told her everything she needed to know. The teacher was trying to keep calm, but Emily could see the tension in her eyes. She knew that something was wrong. Across the hall, in the principal's office, the atmosphere was tense as well. Principal Hayes paced back and forth, his mind racing with questions. The lockdown had been set in motion, but there were still so many unanswered questions. What was the threat? Where was it coming from? And why had the FBI responded so quickly? The principal wasn't alone in his office. Agents from the FBI had arrived and were quickly setting up a command center in the back of the office. They were busy coordinating with local authorities, gathering information, and making sure the school was secured. Hayes had never experienced anything like this before, and he felt out of his depth. But he knew that the agents were trained for situations like this, and he had to trust them. Meanwhile, the agents were scouring the school, moving from room to room, searching for anything out of the ordinary. They were calm and focused, but even they knew the gravity of the situation. The threat they were facing was real, and time was running out. The agents had been briefed that there was a possibility of a dangerous individual targeting the school, but they didn't know exactly where the threat was coming from. All they knew was that they had to act fast. As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the school continued to rise. Emily sat in her classroom, staring at the clock, willing the seconds to go by faster. She couldn't help but wonder what was happening outside, what the agents were doing, and if everything would be okay. She tried to calm her nerves, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she had said to Mr. Jenkins. Was this all just a coincidence, or had she really known something was coming? The answer, though, was slowly becoming clear. Whatever was happening outside, whatever was unfolding, had started with her. Her whisper had set everything in motion, and now, all she could do was wait. Outside the classroom window, Emily could see the agents moving through the hallways, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The once lively school now felt like a ghost town, quiet and on edge. It was hard to imagine just an hour ago. The halls were filled with laughter and chatter. Now, everything had changed, and no one knew how long it would take before they would be able to go back to normal. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. Emily sat in her classroom, trying to distract herself by focusing on the little things around her. The way the light outside flickered through the blinds, the sound of her own breathing, the soft hum of the air conditioning. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept drifting back to the words she had whispered to Mr. Jenkins. They're coming today. She couldn't understand why it felt so important. It wasn't like her to say things like that without a reason. Emily was a normal 12-year-old who didn't have any supernatural abilities or visions. So why had she felt so sure about those 3 words? And why had she whispered them to Mr. Jenkins? She had no answer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening now, whatever was unfolding in the school, was connected to what she had said. Outside, the hallways were still eerily quiet. Teachers had pulled the blinds down in their classrooms, and most of them were gathered at the windows, peering through the cracks, trying to catch a glimpse of what was going on outside. Some students were crying quietly, some were huddling together for comfort, while others stared blankly ahead, unsure of what to do or think. The fear in the air was palpable, and no one knew how long it would last. Everyone was in the dark. Principal Hayes, now sitting in his office surrounded by FBI agents, was trying to process everything. He had been in charge of the school for years, but this was something he never could have imagined. The thought that something dangerous might be happening in or around the school was enough to make him feel uneasy, but the fact that the FBI was involved made it all the more real. They had to be prepared for anything, even though no one had any idea what exactly they were preparing for. The agents in the office were calm, methodical, working as quickly as possible to gather information and plan their next move. Hayes could see the seriousness in their eyes, the way they spoke in quiet, urgent tones, as they made sure the school was locked down as securely as possible. Still, even with all their expertise, there was an unsettling feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. As the lockdown continued, the air inside the school seemed to grow heavier. Teachers were doing their best to keep their students calm, but the tension was rising. The soft buzz of cell phones was the only noise breaking the silence as students and teachers texted their families to check in. But even that small comfort wasn't enough to ease the worry that lingered in every corner of the building. Emily had always been the type of person who tried to stay strong in tough situations. She didn't like being afraid. But today was different. Her hands were trembling as she sat at her desk, waiting for some kind of answer, some kind of sign that everything would be okay. She felt helpless, unsure of what she could do to make things better. Across the hallway, Mr. Jenkins was still driving his bus, his mind focused entirely on the school. The phone calls had been made, the authorities had been alerted, but what if it wasn't enough? What if whatever threat was out there was already inside the school? His stomach twisted with worry as he thought about the students and teachers he had dropped off earlier that morning. He had done what he could, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his job wasn't finished yet. He needed to be sure everyone was safe. Back at the school, Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hall. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat, but it wasn't an agent or teacher. It was just another student. A girl she recognized from her class, who was looking just as confused and scared as everyone else. Emily gave her a small smile, trying to reassure herself as much as the other girl. They both knew that they had to wait it out. Whatever was happening, they would find out soon enough. But the waiting was unbearable. It felt like hours passed by with no answers. The air felt thick with uncertainty. No one knew if they were waiting for something to happen, or if the worst was already over. Emily just wanted to know what was going to happen next, but there was nothing she could do except stay quiet and wait for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The tension inside the school was thick, and it felt like time had slowed down to a crawl. Emily could hear her heart pounding in her ears as she sat still in her classroom, staring at the door. The walls felt like they were closing in, and she couldn't stop thinking about what she had heard earlier. Every tiny noise made her jump, even the distant sound of students shifting in their seats. The fear and uncertainty were suffocating, but there was no way to escape it. In every classroom, students were quiet, whispering in hushed voices, trying to make sense of the lockdown. Some were texting their parents, but the messages they received only brought more confusion. No one knew exactly what was happening or why, but Emily had an eerie feeling that it was somehow connected to what she had said. "They're coming today." The words felt even more important now than ever, but she had no way of knowing how to make sense of them. Was it a warning, a sign, or was it just a strange thought that she couldn't shake off? Outside, the school was locked down tightly, with FBI agents stationed at every entrance. They were moving quickly and efficiently, making sure no one could get in or out without proper clearance. The air was thick with uncertainty, but there was a quiet calm in the way the agents operated. They knew what they were doing. They were prepared for anything, but even they couldn't shake the sense that something big was about to happen. Principal Hayes stood in the office, watching the agents at work. He still couldn't fully grasp what was going on, but there was a sense of urgency in the air that he could not ignore. The FBI had arrived, but they hadn't told him everything. They had asked him questions, lots of them, and given him orders, but the reason for the lockdown had still not been made clear. The fear in his chest was growing as he paced back and forth, waiting for the next update. He just wanted to know what was going on, what was happening, and if it was something his school could handle. Emily, still sitting in her classroom, felt a shiver run down her spine as the door opened suddenly. Mrs. Parker stepped inside, looking more serious than Emily had ever seen her. "Stay here," Mrs. Parker instructed, her voice low. "I need to check something." The teacher quickly stepped back out of the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Emily stared at the door for a moment, her mind racing. What was going on? Why had Mrs. Parker looked so worried? Had something happened outside? Was it possible that whatever was coming, whatever Emily had warned about, was already here? Her thoughts were interrupted as Mrs. Parker returned, this time with a tense look on her face. "We've been told to stay in lockdown for now," Mrs. Parker said in a calm, yet firm voice. "But don't worry. We're safe here." She quickly moved to her desk, checking her phone one more time before putting it away. Emily couldn't help but notice the tightness in her teacher's jaw, the way her hands gripped the edge of the desk just a little too hard. Even Mrs. Parker was trying to keep her cool, but it was clear that there was something serious happening. Minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Outside the window, Emily could see the FBI agents moving in and out of their cars, exchanging brief words, their eyes scanning the building. The hum of their radios mixed with the soft footsteps of teachers moving down the hallway. It felt like everything was moving in slow motion, like the world outside the classroom had come to a standstill. Emily's stomach churned with anxiety as she tried to calm herself. She couldn't stop thinking about the 3 words she had said to Mr. Jenkins. Her mind was spinning, and she just wanted to know if she had done the right thing. What was coming? Why had she said it? Was it a warning or just an empty thought? She had no way of knowing, but now, sitting there in the quiet, it felt like everything hinged on those 3 simple words. The silence in the room felt oppressive. Emily shifted in her seat, feeling the eyes of her classmates on her, though no one said a word. The weight of the unknown was starting to feel unbearable. She glanced at the clock, wishing time would move faster. But the minutes dragged on, and all she could do was sit and wait for the next move to be made. The waiting felt endless. Time had lost all meaning inside the school. Minutes seemed like hours, and every second that passed only made the tension inside the classrooms grow. Emily sat in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as she tried to focus. Her mind kept racing back to the moment when she had whispered those 3 words to Mr. Jenkins. "They're coming today." But now, as the hours ticked by, she wondered if she had been wrong. Had she overreacted? Was it all just a misunderstanding? But deep down, Emily knew that whatever was happening, it was serious. She could feel it in the air. Every shift in the hallway, every faint sound from outside the classroom, made her stomach churn. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever threat was out there was closer than they realized. Outside, the FBI agents were moving quickly and efficiently. They had set up a perimeter around the school, making sure no one could enter or leave without proper clearance. The agents worked in teams, scanning the grounds, watching for anything suspicious. They had been briefed on the situation, but they still didn't know exactly what they were dealing with. They only knew that they had to act fast. Principal Hayes stood in his office, his eyes glued to the monitor as he watched the agents work. His hands were clammy as he shuffled papers on his desk, trying to keep himself busy, trying to make sense of everything. The fear inside him had only grown stronger with each passing minute. The school was locked down, but what if it wasn't enough? What if they weren't ready for what was coming? The phone rang, breaking the silence in the room. Hayes answered quickly, his voice tense. "Yes, we have a confirmed report," said the voice on the other end. "The threat is real. We're moving in." Hayes felt a cold shiver run down his spine. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of urgency in the air. The threat wasn't just a possibility. It was real. And now, everything was about to change. In the classroom, Emily's heart skipped a beat as she heard a loud noise from outside. Her eyes snapped to the door, but no one moved. The sound echoed down the hallway, followed by the hurried footsteps of agents. She could feel the tension rising, her pulse quickening. This was it. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. Mrs. Parker was at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the class. She seemed calm, but there was a nervous energy about her. She moved toward the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Was it finally time for them to leave? Or was the danger still out there? But before anyone could speak, the door opened and an agent stepped inside, his face grim. "Everyone stay where you are," he said, his voice firm. "The situation is under control, but you're not to leave this room until we give the all clear." Emily nodded, her heart still racing. She couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that the agents were in control. They were here to protect them, and that thought brought her a little comfort. Still, she couldn't stop wondering how everything had escalated so quickly. Just a few hours ago, the school had been filled with the usual noise of students laughing, talking, and going about their day. Now the building felt like a fortress, and everything that had seemed normal was suddenly turned upside down. The agent moved quickly through the room, checking each student's face, ensuring everyone was accounted for. Emily could see the other kids looking at her, their expressions filled with questions. Had she known something? Had her warning made all the difference? She wanted to say something, to explain, but she didn't have the words. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the announcement came over the intercom. "Attention, students and staff. The lockdown is over. The threat has been neutralized. You are safe." A wave of relief swept through the room. Emily exhaled, feeling the tension in her chest finally ease. It was over. They were safe. The waiting, the uncertainty, the fear, it was all over. But even as the announcement echoed through the school, Emily couldn't help but wonder, what had really happened? What had she sensed that day, and how had it all unfolded so quickly? She might never know the full story, but one thing was certain. She had made a difference. As the students began to leave their classrooms, Emily walked slowly, still in a daze. The world outside had returned to normal, but the events of the day would stay with her. She had done something that had helped protect her school. And though the threat had passed, she knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again.